Welcome. I'm Sam Faddis. This is Ground Truth, and we're going into now what I guess is the second segment, sort of a continuing series focused on Tibet and really specifically going back to the Chinese invasion of Tibet. With us again, same gentleman we had in the first segment, Jamyang Norbu, who is an author and a political activist and a million other things. But I guess the simplest way to put this is he's dedicated literally his entire life to the cause of Tibetan independence. And in the first segment, which I encourage anybody who hasn't listened to it, I encourage them to go back and listen to it. We started with setting the stage for the Chinese invasion, and I keep using that word emphatically because the Chinese spend a lot of time trying to pretend like there was no invasion. In other words, lying like they do about a lot of other stuff. Well, you started with the Chinese invasion, so going all the way back to 1950 and kind of through the initial stage of Tibetan resistance, armed resistance to this invasion. And we're going to pick up there, but then try to move into sort of the first violent armed uprising against the Chinese. Jamyang, thank you for joining us again.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. Before I start on today's segment about the uprisings, the violent uprising is in Eastern Tibet and Kham and Amdo, I'd just like to, go back a little and talk about what Tibet actually was. I don't want readers to feel that in some ways it was a failed state that the Chinese had come, invaded essentially to restore law and order. So I just going over what I had said earlier, I just want to establish that Tibet was a fully functioning and independent state before the Chinese invasion. That's just after the war. And it threatened none of its neighbors, fed its population unfailingly year after year with no help from the outside world. There were no sort of United Nations and things in those days. And it owed nothing to any country or international institution. And Tibet maintained, although it was, an insular, theocratic, not a modern country at all, it maintained law and order within its borders and conscientiously observed treaties and conventions entered into with other nations. It was one of the earliest country in the world that I know of to enact laws to protect wildlife and environment. Recurrently cited in what we call the Mountain Valley Edicts, issued annually, since 1642. Possibly even earlier, according to some scholars. And also, I want to just establish Tibet abolished capital punishment in circa 1896. It's one of the first nations in the world to do so. And when you think of China, where even now you have, they have the record for capital punishment every year.
Yes.
There are more capital punishments in China than the rest of the world, countries in the world put together. So starting from there, we discussed last time the military invasion of Tibet by the the so-called People's Liberation Army, and the Tibetan, army and its militia in Eastern Tibet fighting back against these invaders and losing the fight essentially. And then Chinese army entered Tibet. Now, this period, there was a kind of a period when the Tibetans, after the Chinese army entered Tibet, when people were just trying to figure out what the hell was going on. And in central Tibet especially, there were a lot of problems because the army was large. 30,000 people came into the city in Lhasa, which is population was 10,000. So, we had to feed the troops. Tibetan government warehouses, storehouses, all had to be emptied. The Chinese troops had to be fed. There were no real supply lines. Motor roads hadn't been built. And there was a lot of problems. So there was, for the first time in its history, Tibet faced inflation. So you can imagine then the ordinary people, and they began to complain. There were a lot of underground activities and this and that and so forth. But we'll get into that later. But what caused all the uprising in Tibet was what happened in Eastern Tibet in 1956, 5 years after 5-6 years after the invasion. Now, Eastern Tibet, it's really important because this is in some ways unlike Central Tibet, which the world thinks of, as Tibet. Eastern Tibet, the population is larger. Area is a little more fertile. Although it's mountainous, these areas are fertile. The population is larger, and that's why the Chinese have always, in some ways, encroached in these areas. In Eastern Tibet, what we call Kham, it's largely half, at least, is Sichuan province, and in the south is Yunnan province. That's where the Chinese have come in. They actually tried to set up a separate province at one time, but that didn't work out. Then just north of that, in Gansu and Qinghai provinces, that is what Tibet's called traditionally Amdo. Again, large population, fairly rich areas. So in these areas, the uprising started. And it started for, two reasons. First is all these areas of Eastern Tibet were settled by Tibetans during the time of the empire. These were imperial garrisons that were sent to these areas to fight against, at that time, Tang Dynasty China in the 6th, 7th, 8th, centuries. So these people already, they had a military kind of awareness in the background. And after the empire collapsed, these people settled there and, became herdsmen and nomads, but they kept their warrior ethos. So they were formidable people there, And, one of the other reasons for, let's say, uprisings taking place there, because Chinese always considered these areas to be part of China. So they started a lot of their political campaigns there first. The thing is, China, like transformation of communist China, China to a communist state, Mao, and this was like formalized. It was going to be done in 2 steps. Step 1 is what they call democratic reforms, which is essentially land reforms, redistribution of land, and the destruction of the landowning class. And the second step was going to be socialist transformation. And I'll get into that. But first, socialist transformation was essentially, turning China completely into a commune, taking the land back from the peasants who they had earlier redistributed to, and turning everyone, into basically a slave of the communist state, working in communes where you didn't have any ownership of land. So when they started the democratic reforms in Tibet, they had already done it in China. Millions of Chinese landlords were killed. Lands were redistributed, landlords were killed. And Mao claimed about 70 or 80,000, but the records we have now, and even Chinese government records, showed practically about 4 or 5 million, at least, landlords were killed. So, but the problem for the Chinese to introduce that to Eastern Tibet was these people had guns. The whole area, people were well armed. They would have made good members of the NRA. So, and the thing is, George Orwell, the writer, in one magazine articles, he pointed out that actually, he said this. I have it. He made an interesting sort of remark, very insightful. He said the great age of democracy and of national self-determination was the age of the musket and the rifle, the bolt-action rifles. He cited the musket for the French and American revolutions because they were easily available and common people could get them. And for on the question of rifles, especially in the late 19th, early 20th century, he talks of the Boers in South Africa, Bulgaria, Morocco, Abyssinia, and even Tibetans, who he says made a successful bid for independence in 1913 from the Manchu Empire. So these weapons played a part in that, and they were very popular in Eastern Tibet. A whole variety of English, Japanese, especially German man-likers, and even American World War I weapons. So there was this culture already, and the Chinese had a problem trying to start their program when all the people were armed. So the first step was what they called, removal of weapons. So everyone had to give up their weapons, and of course they started first, coming out and holding meetings and this and that. But then gradually people became aware of what was going to happen. if they give up their weapons. And so the Chinese had meetings, and finally the Chinese began to use threats. They bought in troops in the areas, and they said, "You better give it up before the Beijing becomes angry with you, and there's no other way. You have to do it." And then in one area called Litang, where there's a very big monastery set up by the third Dalai Lama, largely pastoral area. There, the tribal chieftains and the monastic heads, they got together and had meeting. They said, "Look, this is all going to end badly. So right now, there's a little time. You can fight the Chinese. Let's do it." So there, at least about 30 or 40,000 people got together, and they attacked the Chinese garrison in that area. Gave it a lot of people were killed. Many Chinese died. Finally, the survivors managed to get into their kind of fortress and hold out for a few weeks, and finally, sending cables to Chengdu and to Beijing for reinforcements. And gradually, reinforcements came in. At least a division came. And then the Tibetans, finally, they decided there were a lot of, because the thing was, these are tribal people. They didn't have one real military ruler. Everything had to be discussed, among tribal chiefs.
Right.
So there was some kind of, people say we should fight a guerrilla warfare. Others saying we have to defend the monastery. Now the whole thing in that area, the monastic culture is very important. When you talk of monasteries in Tibet, we're not talking of monasteries like you have in medieval Europe, like the abbeys and the priories, just small, other small, relatively small areas. In Tibet, these were like cities and towns, because it's university towns, maybe in a sense. The comparison would be, because these were the centers for education, even regular education for people. These were the great libraries were there. This is where your art came, and even commercial, because the bank, the monasteries operated as the banks also. They gave loans, and that was also commerce, because you had festivals in these monasteries, with great dancers, this and that, and the population from tens of miles around would gather, and there people would meet and trade, and young people would get have dances and get married, what have you. So these were very important places, and Ditang Monastery was very big. It had a regular population of 5,000 monks, and so that one group of them decided to defend the monastery, and led by one very young chieftain called Urupa, who took power when he was 18, but at that time I think he was in his early 20s. And when the Chinese finally attacked, and this is established now, that it's even the Chinese records show that they bought in a lot of artillery.
Right.
They couldn't bring in tanks because of the terrain, but then they also bought in planes. At that time, they didn't have, let's say, MiG jets and this and that, but and they didn't have, let's say, airfields nearby. So they bought in long-range bombers, and they bombed the monastery, and they destroyed it. But the thing was, people fought. So finally, this chieftain, and it was many days of fighting throughout the monastery complex. And the Chinese came in, and they're fighting all the way through all the temples and burning the place up. Till finally, this young chieftain, he sent a messenger to the Chinese, said, "Look, I'm going to surrender, but I want your top commander general to come and receive my surrender. I'm a great chief. I don't surrender to any Tom, Dick, and Harry." So the top commander came with his staff, and he was really pleased. And that person threw down his rifle, and he reached into his robe, and he pulled out a Mauser pistol, and he gunned 3 of them right down there. Then the Chinese, shot him, of course, and full of holes, and he died, and everyone else were killed. Number of the people managed to escape the monastery, and then they went to the mountains and started, guerrilla warfare for the next couple of decades.
So let me just before we continue, I just want to stop with this image here. I mean, I think you've done a superb job of describing it, but for those people who are listening to this, who don't have a military background, who don't, this is not their forte, they haven't served. What I'm the picture you're painting here of Tibetan patriots armed with rifles,
Bolt action.
right? Bolt action rifles. So we're not even talking, modern day M16-ish AR-15 things. We're talking stuff like people have seen in the movies, bolt action. In between each round, you're probably having to use your bolt action and reload. And you have this capability in a medieval monastery as a defensive position. And against this, we have artillery and long-range bombers, in addition to all the machine guns and rifles of the Chinese forces. When you drop bombs from a long-range bomber, particularly in the time frame we're talking about, 1956 Chinese bombers from whatever altitude, I don't like the term. There's a lot of terminology that's used in reference to modern warfare about precision and and so forth that it bothers me anyway, because nothing about war is ever precise and nothing about war is ever antiseptic or clean. But what you're describing, particularly at this time frame, I mean, a bomber at whatever altitude drops 20 bombs on, this is not a strike on a specific gun emplacement or a target. This is bombs falling all over an area,
Oh yeah.
killing whoever they happen to strike into the middle of a population of people. And frankly, artillery also. I mean, I'm providing this commentary again just to kind of emphasize what you've already said. The same would probably be true about this Chinese artillery. I mean, this is not laser guided projectiles striking a specific soldier or gun emplacement. This is shelling and bombing an entire large area. And you want to talk about collateral damage? Well, this is collateral damage on a massive scale, right? Anybody who's anywhere around this is being killed indiscriminately by the thousands, is what I'm
Yeah.
hearing from you.
Oh yeah, absolutely. The tens of thousands. The thing is, after the bombing flattened the monastery. Recreated it now. In the 2000, and there's some photographs of it, and it's very beautiful. Even now, but at that time they flattened it. Many people were killed, and the thing was, even the bombers didn't require. It was not high altitude bombing because they didn't need to stay high altitude.
Right.
Tibetans didn't have any anti-aircraft capability.
Right.
Bombers came low, bombed the monastery randomly. And that's why, in some ways, the chieftain had to surrender in the end because he didn't want, more and more people being killed. But then so they finally took his body and they strapped it to a kind of the pillar they had, the monastery courtyard, just to demonstrate to the public that he was fine, because he was very famous throughout Eastern Tibet. But before, just to go back a little earlier, when they had the meeting between the tribal chieftains and the monastic heads, they sent letters to all the surrounding kind of districts and other tribes, and principalities. There were smaller kingdoms also in Eastern Tibet, and they sent letters everywhere. So a lot of these areas, they told them, we are going to, rise up against the Chinese on the second day of the Tibetan New Year, which is around February, and we would want all of you to join us. And a number of these areas did so. I actually met this woman from a kingdom of Eastern Tibet called Nyarong, and she was a princess there. Her husband was the king. And she remembers receiving a letter from the leader of Lithang, telling them to rise up. But the problem for her and her kingdom was that her husband had been taken as a hostage by the Chinese to the Chinese center in Tatsudo on the border, and was being held there. So what she did was, and she had no choice, she put on a man's robe. she tied a pistol, and took her rifle and got all the people, especially young people. And she said, "This is what's happening." And she really went through the Chinese. She slaughtered the local garrison. Nothing survived there. Then she went down to attack the capital of Nyarong. There's a castle, old castle. It's called the Castle of the Female Dragon. And she invested it. And she told all her men, when I tell you to attack and you don't, I'm going to shoot anyone who walks back. And I met this old lady. I look at her. She must have been quite beautiful when she was young, but she's very itty bitty, no more than 5'2", 3", in height. She's fierce. She really, the Chinese, of course, panicked. They bought in reinforcements and they were fighting in the mountain. It carried on. Finally, I think in order to cool down that area, they let her husband go. They thought they had given him enough political indoctrination, and he was supposed to go and establish what they called liberalization policy.
Right.
That Chinese were going to be nice to all of them. But then, of course, he joined them, and they all started fighting in the mountains. Eventually, when they were losing, when the Tibetans were, because they didn't stand a chance. But when they started moving towards Lhasa, gradually when they got less and less and less. But they're fighting all the way, all these people. Then also other areas. There's an area called Batang. There's numerous other areas. Also in one other area called Thaya, there was another woman who led the uprising because her father died. And he had fought the Chinese initially, but then he had a heart attack. So finally, the woman, I met her in Dharamsala. Chinese had put her in prison for over 20 years. And finally, when she came out, she came to see the Dalai Lama. I met her, tough old lady, great buddies of mine,
right.
And there were women even involved, even in the leadership position. But a lot of these other areas, like Chaching, these are very important. These are very big, important commercial areas also, and Markham. They were productive. There was a whole lot of industry, metalwork, and jewelry, this and that, all over Eastern Tibet. This is where they produced the great kind of images of the Buddhas, religious reliquaries, and things like this. So these are fairly well-to-do areas, and it's just war throughout the area. Now and this gets a little interesting, is this happened earlier, before 56, was when the communists came to this place of Amdo in northeastern Tibet, which is Qinghai, Gansu province, and a place called Hormuka and Nangra, where they first came, there was immediate uprising. Not only from the Tibetans, but there were also settlements of Mongols there. Mongols joined them. Then there were these Chinese Muslims, in that area. Some of them sided with the communists, but some of them came with the Tibetans. So there was big fighting, like involving 50, 60, about 100,000 Tibetans fighting there, into 3 districts in the beginning. The fighting got so bad, it took over a year. It stopped everything in that area. And it was important to the Chinese because this is close to, getting close to, important Chinese centers. So they sent in some of the most important people to try to talk the Tibetans into giving up. But Tibetans were holed up in a mountain, in snow. Chinese troops couldn't get there. They were freezing to death. So the Chinese sent about 14 or 15 delegations, even using Tibetan lamas and important people. And where I found this out was when Xi Jinping became, leader of China, the president.
Yeah. Yes.
And the Chinese published a number of articles. Digitally, I managed to access them. And there was some from their military publications, which said Xi Jinping's father, Xi Tongxin, was the top political cadre in that area at the time, and he was involved in the pacification. So he managed to finally bring a lot of Tibetan lamas and make these people surrender. And he was quite successful, and it was a big relief for Beijing because Beijing's in the north, so they know they're very close to these areas. So Mao Zedong himself invited Xi Jinping's father down to Beijing and praised him. And this was in the actually magazine article that he was like the great strategian, from there's the Chinese kind of what they call the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. That's one of their earliest novels about fighting. And there they have a great military thinker called Zhuge Liang. And he's a byword for the Chinese intellectual. So Mao said, this person is actually like this. He's a modern version of this because he managed to convince even these very tricky, violent Tibetans into surrendering. But so there the Tibetans surrendered, after, a year of fighting and much misery. But then, after the Tibetans surrendered, one of the persons there in his report, he said, they got about another year where things seemed relatively peaceful. But after that, then, the democratic reforms started, like in the rest of Eastern Tibet. And once again, these people, and by that time, when they tried to do something, they didn't have their weapons with them. They didn't have their, not only rifles, not even muskets left. It's all had to be given. Even spears, So then the real kind of misery is everyone was either dead or fleeing or leaving the land. And this person puts it very sadly. He said, in the end, there's nothing left there except a few old women and men, some children, and the village idiot. That's all there was in that area. So that was, yeah.
So this is, I mean, again, this is one of these things that you've touched on at various points here, but just for the purposes of emphasis. It's it's horrible enough that we have a foreign invasion of, as you have put it, a completely independent, successful nation. I mean, unprovoked, unjustified, no matter what silliness the Chinese come up with to explain this, there's no justification on earth for this invasion, which is resisted. And as we go through these series of segments, be clear, it was resisted not just initially, but then over and over and over again. But in some ways, what really strikes me out of this is what you keep coming back to is that it's not just that they're taking over the country, which is bad enough. And it's not just that they're killing tens of thousands of people, which of course is horrifying. But they begin to put in what they call these reforms, this process. The end result of this is designed to be essentially not just erasing Tibet in the sense of erasing lines on a map. The end result of this, to me, is designed to erase Tibetan culture, religion, history. Basically, you're to destroy the Tibetan people, which the Chinese have failed at, I would submit. But when you come back to these things that they call reforms, that's the nature of the communist beast, right? You're going to break down every other institution in society other than the Communist Party, destroy everything. It's not just physically they're going to own you, they want to own you mentally as well.
Yeah, and the thing is, I think the term genocide can be used here. But the thing is, specifically, there's been a lot of back and forth on this with Western academics. Some of them you can't use these terms, but I use it now because I've done a lot of reading on this. And the person who coined the term genocide, who actually was the instigator of the Genocide Convention in the United Nations,
right,
is a Jewish scholar called Raphael Lemkin. And he was really resentful after they put in the convention because the Russians had dominated the meeting, of the Geneva when they had the convention on genocide, and they're trying to establish that you can only have genocide. It is either it's going to be if fascist countries do that. So like you can't have genocide when socialist countries do it.
Communists can't commit genocide.
Yeah, and also what they wanted was something what Hitler did: immediate destruction of the Jews, killing of Jews in concentration camps over a short period of time.
Right.
But Stalin was careful because he had killed a lot of people before.
A whole lot of people
over time.
Yes.
So what they were very careful to say, the killing of people, destruction of societies over time, is not genocide. You had to have that clause. Now the thing was, Lemkin actually completely came out. He said it is not an immediate destruction of a society, which is genocide, a group of people. There's a long term. If they are undermining the whole process of the society, destroying its culture, gradually removing any structure left, with the eventual aim of, doing away with that people, eventual, he said it is genocide. So that is what the Chinese are doing right now. And they're doing it very carefully. They have this process when they run into some kind of problem or international outcry, they step back and they call it taking one step backward to take two steps forward in the future.
Yes.
So they are not in some ways like the Hitler regime, which is far more brutal and straightforward, or not even like Stalin. The Chinese are very smooth. They can always step back and they say, "Oh, we made a mistake. We won't do that again." Blah blah, this, that, and the other. But you can be sure they'll do it again. They're very careful about it. They take the long-term view of things.
Yes. Yes,
So
exactly. And
yeah,
they exploit the fact that so many people in the West, this is certainly true in the United States, we're at the complete other end of the spectrum.
yeah,
We want immediate gratification. Everybody wants to
right.
be, and the more time goes by, the more this is true. I mean, it's always been the case, but it just accelerates. My God, if you have to wait 5 seconds for an email to open, you're about to have a breakdown. Meanwhile, yeah, the news cycle, 24 hours, everything changes. Nobody's paying attention to a story.
No,
But
the
as you
Chinese.
say, the Chinese are working decade after
Oh yeah,
decade.
and on Tibet, it's like even like on the question of language, they're going to take their time about, like the Tibetan students, when the Chinese had this language issue in Gansu and all this Eastern Tibet, where they demanded that Tibetans now give up studying Tibetan because they're more Chinese, they study Chinese. And students there, even in Beijing University, Tibetan students went on a strike and protest and this and that. They pulled back.
Yep.
They want to time it. And what they did, even not only for Tibetans, but even in Guangdong province, the Cantonese,
Hmm.
you know, that's one of the largest groups in the Chinese world. Their language is very rich. It's not proper Chinese. It's not Mandarin Chinese, but they're very proud of it. It has its own culture, its own linguistic culture, writing, everything. And they wanted Guangdong television to start using Mandarin Chinese and not using Cantonese. And that created, and that area is large, population is huge. So, there were not uprisings, but there were a lot of demonstrations. So they stepped back. They're very clear. But eventually they'll, the moment of weakness, they'll come forward, And this is one of the reasons even we have the problems in Hong Kong, because Hong Kong people are Cantonese speakers, you know.
Right.
They are not, they don't see themselves as, Chinese of the North. So now the Chinese actually, like in these areas, like even in Eastern Tibet, they try to do what they call the pacification. They call it liberalization policies. They call the local chiefs, especially lamas, and try to talk to them to give up. But then the problem was, it started breaking out all over Eastern Tibet. Many, uh, 40, 50, 60, 70 districts, many kingdoms, principalities, fighting everywhere. And there, then the genocidal kind of aspect of Chinese kind of military policy came through. There was a lot of intentionality because when they killed like nomadic communities, I actually had someone who rode with the Chinese, who was a young soldier in the, he had studied in China, Tibetan, and he said his officer told him, don't just kill the men, kill the women, also the children. And he said, why children, even babies? He said, if you kill the nits, they will not grow up to become louse.
Yeah, no, I know. I hear exactly what you're saying, and it's horrifying because it's back to precisely what you're saying. We are exterminating a people and refer and dehumanizing them completely, right? This is the only good Tibetan is a dead
Exactly.
Tibetan. The problem will be solved when they no longer exist. You either give up everything and become one of us, or you die and all of you die. and this is back to what you and I are constantly coming back to, is let's
But
peel the face off this, that the Chinese want to put on it, that they somehow marched in to be liberators or help somebody. No, there's a brutally conquered and independent nation, and then repeatedly over time did everything they could to destroy it and crush it and obliterate the entire culture. And the sick thing is, they're still there.
and the thing is, we are discovering actually these days, in the last decade, people are discovering mass graves in all these nomadic areas. There's been a number of cases, and not only reported by me, but by, the head of the professor in Tibetan studies in Indiana University, who passed away, but he wrote a number of articles on this. Number of these areas in Eastern Tibet, Northeastern Tibet, mass graves were being discovered. And the reason why they're being discovered now is, a lot of areas in Tibet freeze over, and they're sort of, there's
Sure.
permafrost. But now, because the Chinese are mining in these areas, there's a whole lot of activity, infrastructure development. Like, the Chinese are really crazy about these things. Mining, whole lot of digging, and all this comes up. Bones come up, people, like skulls and hair still attached, So it's now coming out. And these are like, I've got photographs and things. So it's not like going away. It's like, it never goes, although this happened, let's say, in the 50s and 60s. We are seeing evidence of it now, coming out now in 2000s, So it's like, you cannot forget. And that's what I try to do, is make sure Tibetans don't forget this. Now, the thing is, in Eastern Tibet, when few groups surrendered, but a lot of people are still fighting, and they're making a retreat. And you know where Tibetans are retreating? To Lhasa, to the capital of Tibet. They knew the Chinese was there, of course. But the thing is, because that Dalai Lama is there, that's the center of their culture and their world. So people gradually began to retreat there. Tribes, all sorts of, little groups, refugees, all began to come into this Lhasa, the city. And these were like, people were fighting all the way. This, and it's like, this is a city of 10,000 people originally. Then you have over 30,000 Chinese troops coming in. And now you have refugees coming in. So, of course, there's a whole, let's say, a pressure cooker there now, developing. And so that I'll save for my next segment of the Lhasa uprising,
Okay.
why it happened. And this is what led up to it. And these refugees, like all over Lhasa, because a lot of these Eastern Tibetan people, they had connections to Lhasa because of many of them attended the great universities of Central Tibet, and of Lhasa,
Right.
to study for their Geshe doctorate degree and this and that. Many of them, of course, have business connection and familial connections because of, even the Dalai Lamas, 4 of them were born in Eastern Tibet, So there is a lot of back and forth there. And people are coming in, sleeping in the parks, putting up tents. And then the Chinese, what could they do? Because they didn't want to introduce Central Tibet to a lot of the programs that were going on in China. They wanted to first, show the Dalai Lama that everything was hunky-dory.
Sure.
But then when people started coming in, they couldn't just at once use the army. They tried to tell the Tibetan government to please kick out all these Tibetan refugees. You have to arrest them and you can't do that. But this is one thing I must say, the Tibetan government, old government, was very ineffective, in some ways corrupt to some degree. But they never did what the French did, arrest their Jewish citizens and things. Although the Chinese asked the Tibetan government to do, take care of these refugees, arrest them, throw them out, they said, never, no, we cannot do that at all. And I think it's to their credit.
So at this, I mean, as you said, okay, so we'll sort of break at this point. With the next segment, we come to what happens in Lhasa next, which I think you've done a superb job of setting the stage for. Is there a way for you to, what you've just talked about is this whole uprising, we'll just call it generically, in Eastern Tibet.
Yeah.
and painted a very effective picture of really the horror of what happened. Do we know still today? Do you have an idea how many Tibetans died in that uprising in eastern Tibet? How many people did the Chinese kill? Any idea?
I think, I've been looking at the Chinese population atlas that was published by Oxford in 1975, I think it was. And you see, they have comparative maps of, male population, female for all of China. And you see in Eastern Tibet a decline in a male population in the 50s, drastic. Now that doesn't give me the numbers, but it shows me something went on there.
Right.
Because if it was during the subsequent famine, the male and female would be affected. I think I'm not a scientist, but equally.
Sure. Of course.
When you have a heavy decline in male, then there was fighting,
Yes.
and then of course the following genocide. So I would easily go to 500,000 people, killed there.
And one of the many things that strikes me about this, and one of the reasons why you and I are taking the time to do what we're doing right now, is a lot of Americans would be aware during this time frame that, for instance, the Russians rolled in to put down an uprising in Hungary.
Yeah.
They would be aware that, a little more than a decade later, what happened in Czechoslovakia. And yet this entire series of events that goes on over all these years, all of the death, the complete invasion and of an independent nation, and then the brutality that follows. I would submit that most of those people who are generally aware of things that happen in Eastern Europe have no awareness whatsoever that any of this ever happened. If they don't understand at all anything about this.
The Hungarian uprising, 56, wasn't it?
Yes.
It was somewhere there.
Yes, the same time frame.
Time and Life magazine, you had cover photographs of the Hungarian freedom fighters.
Right.
Yeah, and, good for them to do that, bring it out. But they were not aware of what was happening in Tibet. The press, like the reporting that was coming out from Tibet was so spotty. There was one Tibetan newspaper in Kalimpong. An old man was bringing out a newspaper trying to report on this, and people were not paying much attention to him.
Right.
There were few journalists, but they were, and also a lot of the journalism at that time was gentleman journalism. People sitting, at the bar, in the local hotel,
Yes.
and talking to a few natives, and then sending their kind of report back home. But so people didn't really have, but there was bombing. Some Tibetans, because we didn't have camera, I remember instead of photographs, one Tibetan from that area had drawn with a pencil,
Oh my God.
thing, and was trying to give it to the BBC, and bombing in not only one area, at least I know in 7 districts there were bombing by Chinese bombers, and killing all over the place. And this is, like earlier there was a kind of short period, honeymoon period, when the Chinese came into central Tibet, and the Dalai Lama, and they said, oh, don't worry, whatever happens, we just want to help reform Tibet and establish you as a modern nation. When that happens, the day that happens, we will not stay in Tibet.
Sure. Sure.
Even if you ask us, even if you beg us to, we are not going to stay. And this is in the Dalai Lama's, own biography. The head of the occupation administration in Tibet, Tang Jingwu, General Tang Jingwu, he told the Dalai Lama.
Yeah.
I think his Holiness feels rather embarrassed, because His Holiness also believed them, and they were very good. Not that we are fools, but Chinese are very smooth.
Well, they're very smooth, and in this case, backed up by a lot of power. I mean,
Power and money.
one of the sure.
Tibet.
One of the things that strikes me listening to you is I think about all the Chinese commentary about what the Japanese did to them during the Second World War and the years before the U.S. got in. Right, the rape of Nanjing. Right, they talk about the famous instance of the Japanese army going into this Chinese city and all the atrocities that occur. So I'm not defending the Japanese army. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not suggesting that the Japanese were justified in that. But it's just interesting to me that they want the entire world to know about atrocities that they claim have been occurred against them. But there's nothing to see here. As far as they're concerned, they want the world to just believe this never happened.
Oh,
All
absolutely.
these people that died, all these people that were tortured, bombed, all of the monasteries were flattened. No, nothing to see here. Move on. This never happened. We came in to help our brothers, and we're there because they want us there. And it just makes the lie that much more monstrous to me. It's not just that you're a monster, but you want us to actually pretend you're not. You
You
won't
know, and
even.
they put down the uprisings in eastern Tibet. You know, first of all, they had to build these massive kind of labor camps, concentration camps, all over the place. You know, scattered all over. Then also, like in certain areas where the uprisings were particularly vicious, there's a lot of people were really going at it hammer and tongs. The Chinese took local villagers, especially heads of villages, older senior people, you know, 20, 30, 40 people on stakes, burnt alive, just to give a warning to the populace not to, encourage, not to side with people who are upright, what they call, rebel bandits. So it's in this. So that I want to talk about, about the Lhasa uprising, how all this contributed to what that happening. But also, this is also that point. I think after that we can talk. This is where the CIA operations start.
Right. Which I
You
do
know.
want. We're going to talk about. We touched on it very briefly in the first episode. For those folks that are not aware, at some point, the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency became involved in trying to assist the Tibetan people, and that's a whole story. I think that's a whole segment into itself. So, I think
Yeah.
this is a great place to break for today.
Oh, right. Great. Yeah. That I think is right.
Thank you very much for being with us, and thank you for listening. We'll talk to you next time on Ground Truth.